from that of the LBJ liberals, instead of the one that cast them as American villains. Nixon's win in 1968 was agonizingly close. He began his first term as a minority president. But the way he achieved that narrow victory seemed to point the way toward an entire new political alignment from the one that had been stable since FDR and the Depression. Next, Nixon bet his presidency in the 1970 congressional elections on the idea that an emerging Republican majority rooted in the conservative South and Southwest, seething with rage over the destabilizing movements challenging the Vietnam War, white political power, and virtually every traditional cultural norm, could give him a governing majority in Congress. But when Republican candidates suffered humiliating defeats in 1970, Nixon blamed the chicanery of his enemies, America's enemies, he had learned to think of them. He grew yet more determined to destroy them because of what he was convinced was their determination to destroy him. Millions of Americans recognized the balance of forces in the exact same way, that America was engulfed in a pitched battle between the forces of darkness and the forces of light. The only thing was, Americans disagreed radically over which side was which. By 1972, defining that order of battle as one between people who identified with what Richard Nixon stood for and people who despised what Richard Nixon stood for was as good a description as any other. Richard Nixon now is long dead, but these sides have hardly changed. We now call them red or blue America, and whether one or the other wins the temporary allegiances of 50% plus one of the electorate, or 40% of the electorate, or 60% of the electorate, has been the narrative of every election since. It promises to be thus for another generation. But the size of the constituencies that sort into one or the other of the coalitions will always be temporary. The main character in Nixonland is not Richard Nixon. Its protagonist, in fact, has no name, but lives on every page. It is the voter, who in 1964 pulled the lever for the Democrat for president because to do anything else, at least that particular Tuesday in November, seemed to court civilizational chaos, and who 8 years later pulled the lever for the Republican for exactly the same reason. Chapter 1. Hell in the City of Angels. You might say the story starts with a television broadcast. It issued from the Los Angeles television station KTLA for 4 straight August days in 1965, culminating Sunday night, August 15th, with a 1-hour wrap-up. Like any well-produced TV program, the wrap-up featured its own theme music, pounding dissonant like the scores composer Bernard Herrmann produced for Alfred Hitchcock, and a logo, likewise jagged and blaring. It opened with a dramatic device, a voiceover redolent of the old L.A. police procedural Dragnet, elements familiar enough almost to make it feel like just another cops and robbers show. It was a hot and humid day in the city of Los Angeles, Wednesday, August 11th, 1965. The gravelly narration began. The City of Angels is the nation's third-largest metropolis. 2.5 million people live here in virtually an ideal climate, surrounded by natural beauty and the benefits of economic prosperity. Within the vast metropolitan spread live 523,000 Negroes. A sixth of them reside in southeastern Los Angeles in an area that is not an abject slum in the New York or Detroit context, but nonetheless 4 times as congested as an average area in the rest of the city. The community had prided itself on its relatively harmonious racial relations, few demonstrations, no massive civil disobedience, little trouble from militant factions. The camera tracks an ordinary-looking residential block, tree-lined and neat, a row of modest ranch houses fronted by postage-stamp lawns, suburban almost. The angle came from a helicopter. KTLA TV's Telecopter was the first of its kind. The utility of the Korean War vintage Bell 47G5 with the camera affixed to its belly had so far been mostly prurient. Shots of the swimming pool where Marlon Brando's maid had drowned, of the well that swallowed a darling little girl, of movie stars' mansions being devoured by brush fires in the Hollywood Hills. Now the chopper was returned to its wartime roots. Los Angeles's black citizens were burning down their neighborhood. When the Watts riots began, television stations sent in their mobile cars to cover it. They were stoned like a scene from Leviticus. The next day, militants called